Welcome, everyone, to our Growth from Home Northeast Cannabis Legalization panel. I'm Jeremy Berke. I'm a reporter at Business Insider, now known as Insider. I cover the cannabis industry, everything from small startups all the way up to the largest publicly traded companies and state and federal policy as well. So I'm really excited to discuss Northeast legalization with our all-star panel here. Before we dive into the discussion, I think it might be useful to give everyone a kind of state of play very briefly about, where cannabis legalization is on February 2nd, 2021, as we're recording this, and where we kind of think it's headed and some of the major developments over the past, 8 or 12 months. So in November, cannabis was on the ballot in 5 states. It passed all 5 states, surprisingly enough. The polling was looking a little touchy, but people voted for legalization. It is very popular among Americans. South Dakota was actually the first state to legalize both medicinal marijuana and recreational or adult use marijuana in one fell swoop, which is unique, firstly, because, it's a deep red state, and secondly, because it sort of skipped over a major step. I mean, it took California decades to go from medicinal to recreational legalization. In terms of the industry, investors, industry participants, companies are perhaps most excited about New Jersey. It's the largest market that legalized in 2020. It also is what some say a catalyst for legalization across the Northeast. So it's right next to New York, economically powerful. It's the center of Wall Street. It's the center of a lot of culture and a lot of powerful people. So that's a huge signal for the industry. And on top of that, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, even states like Virginia have made lots of moves to push for legalization this year. But sitting here in February, New Jersey legalized in November. It is not yet legal. It's stuck in limbo for various reasons that we'll get into. And New York, for its part, has found legalization easier said than done. It failed the past 2 legislative sessions to get it passed. So we'll discuss all of that. But first, I'll kick it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. So Shirali, let's start with you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. My name is Shirali Patel. I started my career working for various government entities, learning politics within the state, and got insight into the broken criminal justice system. Currently engaged in private practice and federal class action litigation, with the national opioids case being one of the matters I'm in. I've loved cannabis since I was in college, but became serious about the industry 5 years ago. Ventured out to Colorado, started networking, educating myself, and then when I lost loved ones to cancer and opioids, I decided I couldn't be silent anymore and started to make myself visible. By August of 2019, I submitted an application as the president of my team to obtain a medical license to cultivate, manufacture, and dispense medical cannabis. Having navigated the process and facing the challenges I did, I feel like I earned my sweat equity, and I feel like I have to help educate and empower others on how to get into the legal industry. So I founded Blaze Responsibly, which is my brand and company, to share information and education. I was also part of NJCAN, which was the Vote Yes initiative for adult use, and I'm an executive board member for the Cannabis Law Committee for the State Bar. Thanks for having me.
For sure. So we'll just go around my view here. Jacqueline, you're up next.
Hi, Jacqueline Bennett. So I'm sitting in Manhattan at the moment and have spent my career doing a myriad of things sort of around the globe and around the table as it pertains to investing, advising, and operating companies. And I think the common theme amongst that has always been looking for ways to do things better and to support and be an advocate for groups, women, minorities, just use whatever voice that I have in any situation. And I was exposed to cannabis when I was working still at a Wall Street firm when we were looking to transact into the industry, and was intrigued, to say the least. It reminded me a little bit of why I fell in love with Detroit, which was back in sort of 2013, thinking about we have this clean slate opportunity to build something differently and build something in an equitable way, and some form of reform, judicial reform. So echoed that once I got involved in 2018, have spent my time investing in advising companies and helping build operations. But I think the key theme, or the most important thing, is actually finding a group of people who are valuable think tanks to be surrounded to push and align and push the industry forward in a way that is sustainable and in a way that corrects the wrongs of the past as best as we can. I think I've been blown away by the incredible people that I've come across to date, and I look forward to continuing to find those partnerships.
Great. Nader, you're next.
Hi, everyone. Nader Pearson here, New Jersey native, longtime cannabis entrepreneur. Been working mainly as a digital strategist, media, and founder of SMART, which is the Student Marijuana Alliance for Research and Transparency. And so, just been really working. Honestly, my whole premise has been really getting the next generation of leaders prepared and excited about this industry. There's a lot of folks who are currently paving the way and have been doing so for a long time. And as times have changed and technology becomes more involved, the digital landscape becomes more involved. Younger people start getting more into voting and becoming of age to do those things. We become more of a topic of conversation. And ultimately, when we look at some of the best and brightest businesses in the world, those are started by people maybe not 40 years old, 35, 20 years old that started in a college dorm room, right? So we know innovation is sparked within young minds. And so really, again, being, fervent for that. And even as, thinking about colleges and universities and the roles that they play in legalization and research. So I'm definitely excited to be here amongst you all.
Awesome. Catharine, I will kick it over to you.
Hi, I'm Catharine Dockery. I am the founder of Vice Ventures, which invests in early stage vice businesses. And one of the categories we look at is actually cannabis. We tend to be brand investors, and alongside of that, we follow the laws pretty deeply, and we try to get as politically connected as possible to make sure that when cannabis does become legal in these states, social justice is the headline. So that's kind of like what we're focused on, despite obviously focused on making money too, but yeah.
Great. Last but not least, Janita.
Good afternoon, everyone. Janita Penny, founder and principal of Budding Solutions. I transitioned my consulting firm to support the cannabis industry fully in 2015 and quickly realized that I was not going to have a business opportunity without advocating for what it is that we want to see in this industry. In addition to that, I had actually beat a cannabis charge, had my record expunged, not because I wanted to be in the cannabis industry, but because I needed to do that to continue to support the Fortune 500 clients that I was dealing with at the time. Having gone through that experience, it was something that I could tell, policymakers and community leaders at every level just how difficult it is to go through that process, even when you do have the money to hire the best attorney, even when you do have some, understanding of what it takes and why this is important to do. So as much as I love to talk about the work I've done in industry, I am very honored to talk a lot about the work that I've done on the advocacy side of things, especially on policy development. Several years ago, as the head of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, we developed and put out a municipal ordinance that would help cities across the country with their social equity efforts. And I continue to do that work, having testified before Congress about the role of small business and the need for support from the federal government. So again, here with the perspectives of a consumer and cannabis lover, as well as someone impacted by criminal justice and coming from the communities that it sounds like we're all here to make sure are considered and prioritized as we legalize in the Northeast.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Shirali, I want to start with you. You're going to have some expertise on this question. I mentioned this in my introduction, but New Jersey's legalization, is still in limbo. Could you walk us through where the continued disagreements are and how you expect to see these resolved, hopefully soon, but maybe not so soon?
Yeah, it's been really frustrating given that New Jersey citizens voted for this months ago and we are still arresting people left and right. Let me start with the one good thing. Our Attorney General did issue guidelines to halt prosecutions of cannabis-related offenses, but that doesn't apply to law enforcement, right? And so in cities like Newark, we're seeing the same arrests that were happening last year, which is crazy. The main point of contention has been addressing penalties related to underage possession and use. So when the original legalization bills were passed or voted on, S21 and A21, and the decrim bill, there was discrepancies between the two bills. And so the governor said, you guys need to clean this up before, I can sign off on it. And so the Senate and Assembly both introduced a cleanup bill, and they passed committee, but then senators voiced opposition because they felt that it was too lenient on minors, which is ridiculous. And then the noise started happening in Trenton that the governor is going to probably issue a conditional veto because he doesn't like the language that's within the bills. And so in light of that, Assemblyman Benji Wimberly just this past Friday took initiative, and he introduced a bill that passed Assembly Committee addressing penalties, which proposed ages 18 to 20 would face a fine, $50 for 1 ounce, and above that it would be a $100 fine. And individuals under 18, no formal court proceedings. It would be either juvenile intervention or a point of violation warning, which is a step in the right direction. And so now the vote is supposed to happen in Assembly on February 8th. That's when they have a full quorum. And then the Senate should ideally introduce a similar bill, also pass that. Once that cleanup bill is passed, then the legalization and this cleanup bill and decrim bill will all go up to the governor, hopefully to sign within the next week or two. That's ideal, but that's really been the biggest issue. Obviously, social equity is another concern because the legislation really doesn't speak to that, sadly. So I don't know why they weren't listening, but that's going to be for the incoming Cannabis Regulatory Commission to deal with. But that's currently where we're at right now in New Jersey.
Before we dive into the social equity piece, or the lack of a social equity piece in legislation, I wanted to quickly follow up. I mean, and feel free, everyone on the panel, to chime in here, but how much of a signal does it send that they're going to remove court proceedings for those under 18 who are caught with possession? And how much of a paradigm shift is this from even a decade ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge plus because, I mean, the fact that senators want to still trap children and youth in the criminal justice system says a lot, right? Because once you get into the system, like Janita probably knows, when you have a record, it's not just about expunging that record. That record prevents you from so many other things, right? From getting jobs, from housing, a lot of different benefits. And so the fact that they're removing this, that you don't have to interact with law enforcement in a traditional court proceeding, it's reducing the interaction. And I think it says a lot. So I'm happy. It's not perfect, because I don't like the juvenile intervention piece, because what that means is it's a signed agreement between law enforcement and the youth setting conditions. What those conditions are, I don't know. And so that gives me a little bit of anxiety, but it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Janita, I saw you nodding along, so I'll kick it over to you to give you your perspective here.
Yeah, I was asked a couple of weeks ago if I was happy with where we were, and I agree that we're going in the right direction. But even beyond, what happens at the law enforcement level, the collateral damage that is, that lingers for so long is what we have to really work to remove. We have to remove the opportunity for law enforcement to handle two different kids differently, right? So when you start talking about, station house adjustments and things like that. No, I know what that means. It means that the white kid gets the slap on the wrist, and it means that the black kid gets the book thrown at them, that everything is documented, and it is going to, again, be there, whether they're talking about applying for a job, a student loan. And I know that we've made some progress on the student loan, on the federal side of this, as it relates to keeping kids from being able to access federal student dollars. But we have to, day one, address this and not leave 4 months for your arrest statistics to be on par with last year when the people have voted to legalize this.
To follow up on that, I mean, what would a idealized version of the bill look like from your perspectives? Janita, I can start with you and then give the others some time to think about that. But idealized version in terms of, A, social equity, B, the questions about racialized arrest statistics, and C, underage, the underage question that has been a sticking point here.
Ideally, we see a scenario where, first of all, Illinois, day one, cannabis tax revenue was going into a dedicated fund to go into the communities. We're not waiting for social equity businesses to fund reinvestment in the community, right? We're asking the industry to step up. We have to see automatic expungement, record sealing, commutation of sentences, whatever everything that's needed to reconcile folks and make them whole day one. I could go on and on. I'm going to open it up for someone else.
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
I agree with everything Janita said, and there is so much more that you can get into, but like she said, the key is automatic expungements, right? Because getting an expungement is not easy. You have to hire a lawyer if you have the means, and then when you don't have the means, you're left at your own resources and you're trying to figure things out. Instead, the state really needs to create an ability to go online, to fill out your information and get it automatically expunged, get your record sealed. And then with respect to social equity, like she mentioned, we can dedicate resources right now. We don't need to wait for legalization. We already know that the war on drugs failed and it devastated communities like Newark, Trenton, Camden. It's real. The statistics speak for themselves. So the fact that the state doesn't want to act ahead of itself, it bothers me, but that's government. I think they're always slow behind, the wheel. So hopefully I'm going to be optimistic that New Jersey can do the right thing because like you mentioned, it will be a catalyst for the other states around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going
to
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nader, and then we'll go to you, Catherine.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add the main aspects, that we're seeing. Obviously the one aspect of the youth, right, is super important for the simple fact that one, we know that they can be treated differently, to Shanita's point, right? We've seen that time and time again, just through implicit biases, right, that happen in the system. So eliminating error for that. But we're also seeing, again, the opportunity for medical home grow as well, right? So that's something that's being put on the table, and that's going to be most important for the medical market as they open up for adult use, because we don't necessarily see that becomes a kind of an afterthought a lot of times, right? The medical market. And what happens to that as adult use expands. But, alternatively, the qualifying conditions might expand, right? And we might see more people getting involved in the medical market as a transition of the adult use in general. So having, that home grow in place, I think is going to be super important for just, equity's sake in terms of people being able to provide their own medicine at home and not being penalized for doing so, especially when we know probably people will end up doing so just because of the nature of, some people being able to partake in legalization and others not. So this gives people an opportunity to at least, enjoy the benefits and the rights of legalized cannabis. And I think there's definitely becoming a distinction between cannabis in the law and marijuana in the law, if you really read it. So that's going to be really important as well, because that is like the most backwards thing I've ever heard. And it just really goes to the core of racism and why this needs to be, really combed through. Because if you see that and you're educated like we all are, that is a semantical thing that is based in racism that they're coding into the law, right? And so if we don't do that, it's exactly what Shanita's talking about, right? You can see it in the law right there and then, right? Oh, this is cannabis and this is marijuana, right? These are very different. No, it's not, right? So that's something that, we still see that politicians and legislators are still having to figure out themselves. So we're still going to need to be, more hands-on, even if we think that this is going in the right direction.
Catherine.
I echo all of that. I think everybody on this panel is like 100% correct. And as a team of vice presidents, we get extremely angry sometimes because we see how the laws are moving, and they go so slow that it doesn't really. You almost want more leadership, right? Or like new leadership. So instead of getting angry, something that we found was helpful on our team is we tried to identify what would be the best place to get information from, to get money, to support. And for those of you watching who want to support, I would highly, highly recommend that you make a donation to the Drug Policy Alliance, because they're first and foremost making sure that when cannabis legalization goes past, it's fair for everybody. And it makes the most sense for the industry. So I would highly recommend everybody check that out.
Thanks. Shirali, I wanted to turn to something that you mentioned, the relative lack of a social equity piece in New Jersey's legislation that hasn't been signed into law yet. Why does that lack exist? And, to put it not delicately, why is that due to New Jersey's Republican elected members?
I don't even know if it's necessarily the Republicans, because it's both sides that aren't listening to what the people really want. The first iteration of the legalization bill that was passed didn't even mention social equity. So the second version all of a sudden now it's saying, okay, we're going to take some tax revenues and put it into social equity programs. Programs are not defined. Social equity applicant is not defined. They define impact zones very broadly. And so I think the problem is that they're not listening to the organizations that are on the ground that understand the market that they're supposed to be serving. And so they claim to have an open door policy. I testified on S21 in front of the Senate. I provided letters. I made myself available. And I was told, hey, your letter is circulating, but not one thing did they take into consideration, let alone the fact that there's glaring errors on definitions. Cannabis extract is defined incorrectly. That's law. I mean, we shouldn't even have errors like that, right? So that's aside the point, but I think it's clear that they're just not listening to the right voices. Trenton has a lot of lobbyists that are paying money to skew bills in their favor, and it speaks a lot more for the MSOs to be successful and not for the smaller people, right? Because now we're called minority applicants and women-owned, and it's nice to have a set-aside, but it needs to be equal here. Right? And we don't see that. And that's why I have a little bit of faith in this incoming regulatory commission, because truly that's going to be the agency that dictates what social equity will be. And so far we know Jeff Brown, who was the former commissioner, and Diana Wayne, who was with the ACLU, are going to be a part of that. Those are two really powerful voices who want to do the right thing. And so I'm just keeping my hopes high for the regulatory commission to do their job, because clearly the legislature couldn't figure it out.
Yeah. We spend a lot of time on New Jersey. I want to talk a little bit about New York, which has planned or is attempting to legalize cannabis this year. Jacqueline, could you walk us through a little bit about the economic opportunity that legal cannabis in New York presents?
So I think the timing's obviously very fortuitous or motivating given 2020 and the impact from the pandemic. So New York it was presented in 2019, did not pass then because the social equity policy or piece of the legislation was not satisfactory. And so then in 2020, we were distracted, obviously, by the pandemic, and it wasn't a priority. And now here we are in a situation where economics are motivating. We also have the backdrop of 2020, which presented a lot of the systemic issues in this country. And as it pertains to cannabis legalization specifically, we now have years and years of data from the other states that have come online, and where I feel the early states, it was almost like rush to get this market up and running as opposed to prioritizing restorative justice. And as the more participation, I think, and the more contemplation, sort of that 360 holistic understanding of what the core issues are, but also how egregious the war on drugs really has been for those impacted communities. And I'm pleased that New York has taken its time, and I hope that what comes from that on April 1st is that we have a policy that really learns from other states and also incorporates what the population is asking for, which is, yes, the state wants to make revenues and sort of make up for some of the impact of what has occurred through the pandemic, but also the fundamental issue is, let's try and restore some of these major damage that's been impacting these communities for decades. And this is a clear opportunity to do something, to correct a little part of it. So I'm excited that we've got some really great voices within the New York State government, and we'll keep pushing. We'll see what happens on April 1st, but feeling optimistic that there's going to be a good skew towards the right priorities, which is really returning or supporting impacted communities. And just very quickly, one thing that we're excited about, so I've been participating broadly in the industry for a while, but also there's a group looking to actually build programs here. There's obviously license applications, but what are some of the interesting the ways to sort of fundamentally make an impact? And what I mean by that is, to Shanita's point before, some of the solutions are a little bit band-aid, and it can be there's a policy that's put in place, and it seems like, or a education scholarship, let's just say, for those re-entering society, but that doesn't solve sort of that, the lifelong issue of the impact of having, whether it's a criminal record or just in general opportunities because of that delay in time. So just trying to encourage people to think sort of holistically about where the core of the issues are, how to really make a difference. Like, someone needs a paycheck, not necessarily a degree on day one. And so let's really think about what the core needs are and try to get to those first.
To hone in on the economic question in New York, Cuomo, or you listen to Cuomo and his top aides talk about this, it's an opportunity for tax revenue. COVID has impacted state budgets, business for lack of, a better term is leaving New York in some respects, and they need an industry to sort of prop up the revenue. But the key question here is, it does take a long time for states to start marijuana markets, to have commercial dispensaries open, to get the licensing structure in place, as we're seeing with New Jersey. So Jacqueline, if you could kind of help us walk through what the revenue has looked like in past states that have legalized, like Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, and how this may apply to New York, whether or not this argument about cannabis tax revenue will actually fill in the pandemic deficit budget gap, or that sort of a political push, if you will.
Yeah, I think so. The anticipation, assuming that there is a policy that is the program that will be implemented is announced April 1st, the complications of then the license application process, which we would expect to take until probably the end of 2021 into 22. Realistically, operations may be up and running by the end of 22 into early 2023. And then it all depends on how, what the support is, how the licenses are allocated, essentially, and then what sort of funding support is around that. So 2023, a full year of revenue is probably my best guess. So, but I think there's a lot of activity that happens around that as well. You'll see whether it's real estate, people starting to put apply for leases. There's sort of the infrastructure and sort of the building that happens around before the operations are revenue generating will also provide some stimulation. But 2023 will be the big impact.
I'd love to jump in here while we're talking about New York. We can't afford for it to take until 2023, right? And the cannabis industry cannot continue to be looked at for tax revenue to fill gaps when you're not supporting the industry that's paying those taxes, right? So what I'd like to see, and we don't have a robust medical program like Arizona for the flip of the switch, and then 3 months later, you've got adult use retail sales, right? You don't have Illinois, where you had MSOs that were able to flip the switch, generate $1 billion, right, in sales in a year, and then 250 million of that go to the communities. So we need to assess what medical operators have done and how they can be helpful to adult use legalization. But the days of being grandfathered in, and then we're taking months and years to figure out social equity. Meanwhile, social equity licensees in LA are bleeding cash if they're not already out of business. Folks in Massachusetts that are trying to take advantage of these programs are being backed down by the very companies that should be supporting it. So no, we can't accept that for New York. And if New York takes until 2023, then that very sophisticated legacy market will continue to thrive. New Jersey will come in, Pennsylvania may even swoop in and start to take away that tax revenue from the state of New York. So New York's got to figure it out. And there are great examples for us to look at in Colorado now, as they are a decade into this thing addressing social equity. And then folks like California who are leveraging funds and institutions within the state to support these efforts in a meaningful way, as opposed to reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think your comparison to Arizona, for example, the medical market here is very small, so there is no turnkey solution. A lot of the infrastructure does have to be built out, and there will be the allocation of licenses that are awarded to certain groups, which is a positive. You know, there's a support that is needed, helping with application writing, and then everything sort of that goes around building setting up and establishing an operation. So I totally hear your point, Janita. I think the sense of urgency is real, but I think ensuring that the allocation of opportunity is spread appropriately also will mean that it takes a little bit more time. So it is that trade-off, but I do hear your point.
And while we're trying to figure it out for, the folks that would benefit from these programs, the people who have money are taking advantage of distressed real estate all over New York. There's not a day that goes by that somebody's not saying, hey, Janita, I'm getting property. So when you've got some folks ready to apply in New York, I've got the real estate. The folks who get to take advantage of these opportunities that present themselves as markets fluctuate and things like that are not here with the heart to give to these programs. So we have to consider that as we legislate, and we have to say, hey, MSOs, we know that you want adult use. How are you going to ensure that these small businesses have inventory? What is your commitment to, allowing a lane for other types of businesses? But I know we have a lot of work to do, and we could talk about this all day. I won't go any further.
Yeah, I just one thing that I'd want to add really quickly is that, there's obviously a ton of reasons to be really angry, but one thing that I think would be a shining light of hope potentially is that Cuomo is obviously a super polarizing character, right? There's no surprise there. But he is going to want to be remembered for the person who passed the cannabis law, right? So when I think of that and I think of his pragmatic views on vice in general, it makes me slightly less angry.
Yeah, I would say I think it's people like Murphy, though. You could look at Murphy the same way you look at Cuomo, right? Of somebody who said they ran on that platform, and now look at what Murphy's doing. You know what I mean?
I think he's doing his best. I'm a huge fan of Phil Murphy personally.
They're always doing their best. You know what I mean? And so I would say even looking at Massachusetts as an example, right? Where I think at a certain point, some of these governments are going to have some teeth, because you have, big MSOs lobbying, right? We just went to New Jersey. We're just at all the hearings, and you have every time, ease comes up and they start to mention that we like the bill the way it is, the delivery licenses, we like them the way they are. And it's those aren't equitable licenses, the way that structure is set up. So maybe you like it, but I start to hear that while I'm literally, waiting for my turn to advocate on behalf of the community, right? So there's a lot of that backdoor dealing going on. And when you look at Massachusetts, you literally had, the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission do their best to get 3 years of exclusivity. You had delivery equity applicants really fighting to make sure that they could maintain that, because it was promised to them in 2017 or 2018, right? And then when we got to it, and now it's the time to get it, you had almost 90% of, non-social equity dispensaries in Massachusetts file a lawsuit, right, against this provision to say that this is inequitable. And it's what? So we have to, you have to then threaten with the boycott, right, of their dispensaries to finally have this lawsuit drop, right? And then to your point, we're talking about MSOs contributing, but this is the type of behavior that we see from MSOs, right, on a consistent basis. So I'm just when does it give? Oh, it gives when we put our foot down, right? And so unfortunately, that is kind of where you gotta, have some teeth, and also look into these governments to be with them, to give them options to say, don't accept whatever money you get, right away.
And if I could just really quickly,
go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
To that point that, Nadir brought, and Janita also brought up with the MSOs, because, what's happening is in New Jersey, at least, the medical facilities, they're grandfathered in, right? Have they done anything for the community yet? Not that I've seen. And that's shameful, honestly. And with respect to the regulations, it's almost like we have to get extreme, because look at what California did a few years ago, not in cannabis, but with certain publicly traded companies. Their entire boards were all male dominated. So a law was passed that mandated at least one woman needed to be on that board, right? Well, maybe we need to do something like that in cannabis companies. If you're going to be an MSO and you don't have one individual that was actually harmed by the war on drugs, that was actually out there on the streets risking their lives while you guys make profit, it just doesn't match up. And so it's almost like we're leaning towards having almost extreme type regulations in order to get the people involved in the industry. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, you all wonderfully preempted my next line of questions here. But Janita, I wanted to turn to you. And you put it very aptly about where the MSOs can work with activists. But how can the industry, the companies in New Jersey itself, or that want to be in New York itself when it goes recreational, how can they and what can they do to work with activists to repair the harms of the drug war? And where are these sort of the economic angle for the MSOs and the justice angle for the activists? Where are those in opposition? And how do you bridge that gap?
We've got to engage everyone at the table, right? And everybody has to be clear about who they are, why they're there, and what it is that they want out of this, right? So when you have an MSO, send a representative into the community, especially in the advocacy circles, right? And they are, saying all the things that people want to hear, but then you see the business operating and doing something completely different, right? We have an issue. So keep it real. We're about 6-7 months out from all these commitments that were made last year when Black Lives mattered so much, right? So now we need to hold folks accountable to the commitments they've made, right? Now we need to make sure that if you are committing to doing work in the community, that you're doing it. Because I know in the state of Pennsylvania, there were plenty of commitments made to communities, to minority-owned businesses, to disadvantaged businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and those promises and commitments were not fulfilled. And those people were rewarded with additional licenses in other states because they talked about that program that won the license for them in another state, and they've never done anything. So right now what we want to do is we want to see MSOs and we want to see small businesses and we want to see communities come together. A great place to start for me is that huge list of community organizations that are doing the work in Illinois that just got checks because of cannabis tax revenue. Who are the counterparts in New Jersey that can stand at the table and say, all right, we've legalized cannabis. We are doing, healthy food. We're doing health and wellness. We're doing education. We're doing personal and professional development in these communities. We're providing something. And so now cannabis tax revenue will allow us to continue to do that work. We cannot depend on an MSO, any MSO, to say they're going to give a community what they need. Because first and foremost, they probably don't know or understand that community. So real teeth around community and municipal commitments. And that comes from balancing out this local control that we are trying to figure out in most states. It also has to be genuine. Again, let folks do the work they're doing. I think that expungement is something that has to be done, but a cannabis company doesn't necessarily have the resources to be able to do it, but support the folks that are. Make sure that a part of your corporate social responsibility ties into the community and the industry in a meaningful way. But stop being scared of activists too. So many of these MSOs are scared of folks that aren't polished and able to speak their language, but they also want these folks to come into their dispensaries and buy their products. Well, we are tired of being consumers. We are so tired of supporting your business when you're not supporting us as individuals, as as communities. And so the radical collaboration is that we as activists also have to like get the chip off our shoulder a little bit and say, hey, these folks exist. They're in the ecosystem. And if we leverage them in a real way, then we all rise. So that's my take on radical collaboration. My clients are, the legacy operators that want to become legit operators in the regulated world. My clients are MSOs. My clients are municipalities. So it really is about just finding a common ground and then having folks stay in their lane.
And I can open up this question to whoever wants to chime in here, but what is the government's role or those that actually write this legislation in making sure that incentives align between MSOs and large publicly traded cannabis companies and activists that are sort of on the forefront of these justice movements?
Well, I'll just really quickly,
yeah, go ahead.
People, these big entities only listen to the government. So I don't know who else you're going to get, they follow those set of rules, more or less. Right. So I think, whatever confines you can get, they're always looking for the next regulation compliance aspect. They really care about that because that's what matters to their investors. Right. Especially when investors are coming from mainstream and larger VCs and LPs. Right. So, I think that those guidelines definitely help and that muscle is always flexed when needed.
Shirali, I think you wanted to jump in there as well, or
he basically said what I was going to say, right? And because they're the ones that are cutting the checks, because they want legislation to be written to help them out. And so if the government's cognizant of that, it's their responsibility to make sure that they're writing these rules and regulations to make it fair, right? Because right now it's clear, at least in New Jersey, I'm going to speak specifically on New Jersey because it's been years that this legalization bill has been floating around. It wasn't so public before, but you guys had years to listen to people. And maybe, and that's where I failed in standing up before because I waited, like Janita said, I waited for somebody to do the right thing. And when I didn't see that happening, I was like, all right, I had enough now. Now I'm just going to have to start calling people and doing what I have to do because people need to be educated. I've had people texting me, hey, it's legal. Like I'm going outside and, and I'm like, guys, it's not legal yet. You could still get arrested. Where's the government in educating our people? So they absolutely have a role and responsibility in doing the right thing. And like Nader said, they're the MSOs, they're the ones looking for the regulations. And so it goes both ways.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question here. While this is top of mind, Schumer and the rest of the Democratic leadership, they outlined a plan or a draft plan to try and legalize or decriminalize marijuana this year while they hold a majority in the Senate. It's a very thin majority. There was not a lot of actual teeth to the announcement they made the other day. But where do you all think this is going to go? I mean, are you hopeful that the U.S. will federally legalize marijuana this year, or at least decriminalize marijuana, or is this something that's going to be stuck within the gears of Capitol Hill for a long time? Jacqueline, we can start with you.
Yeah, I would say there are so many pieces to it, and there are so many federal agencies that will be impacted by federal legalization and need to play a part. I mean, we see what's happening just with the FDA right now in terms of the farm bill that was passed, and now we're still at this point where we haven't even defined or decided on whether it's supplement or under food and beverage. And there's a lot of the industry participants who want a certain result also don't necessarily understand the path to present data in a cohesive way and say, these are the patient outcomes that have occurred, and this is why we want it defined this way, and this is best for the industry. So, we work pretty closely with some of the individuals who have formed committees around advising the FDA, and also now a closer line into the White House. And the rhetoric I can't say that I'm a expert in government negotiations, particularly in the US, but from those who I am around who have had decades of experience, this is something that requires a committed effort, an office for cannabis reform, and it's going to take time. There are so many constituents that will be impacted, not to mention the hundreds of millions of the population. So as much as it seems, I want people to have access. I want it to be equitable. I want that for the industry. I just think like we saw some of the early states come online, and it was, unlimited licenses and sort of the rollout being a little bit more or a lot more thoughtful and in a staged way, to me, feels better. With the ultimate outcome being that the markets open up generally. But I think we really need to get the humanitarian, the social equity part right. And right now it's so nuanced state by state. To have sort of it open at a federal level just seems a little chaotic.
I think it's going to take time as well. And my hope is that we see cannabis descheduled because it doesn't belong on the list of controlled substances. And I only raise that because there's been a push for rescheduling it, which I hope doesn't happen, because then cannabis would remain under the purview of the FDA. And we already know that Big Pharma dictates that arena. So let's hope that's not the case. And really the legislation needs to speak to real criminal justice reform. And I think Senator Booker's been vocal about what restorative justice actually means. It's not just about expunging records, but it's about freeing the individuals who are sitting behind bars. And it's difficult when you look at history, because when prohibition was repealed, not that many individuals were released from prison. But the reality is, in the early 1900s, prison terms were shorter than they are today. And so hopefully we can see a plan that's going to address this exact issue, because I don't want to see the day where we have federal legalization and people are still sitting behind bars for a nonviolent cannabis-related offense. And so they need to fix that. That's going to take time. And I don't think the federal government's going to come in and dictate what states are doing, because similar to alcohol, states have the right to regulate sale and distribution. And so it'll be interesting. And I also hope that we can open up the floodgates for research opportunities for medical cannabis, because we're so behind compared to other countries like Israel and what they're doing. And that's my real hope. But I think it's going to take time.
I totally agree that it's going to take time, but what I know is that you've got a lot of young talent in DC that are chomping at the bit to get this right, to connect the dots between all of the agencies, and then to make this make sense for the states in a real way. I'm hopeful because we've got Schumer, Wyden, and Booker saying that we need to streamline. We know that there have never been as many pieces of cannabis legislation at the federal level as there have been in the last, 3-4 years. With that, we've seen a lot of work done to be ready when, how they say, stay ready so you don't have to get ready. Last year, as the PPP and COVID relief, as that program and COVID relief was being worked through, we had language ready to go that would allow cannabis businesses to take advantage of the relief that was being provided. We had it ready to go, and it was in there. It passed the House. Okay, we didn't get the action we needed, the support we needed in the Senate on COVID relief, period. It wasn't about cannabis. So I think that with Booker, whose legislation is, leaves nothing to be desired as it relates to criminal justice reform, social justice, it also gives that oversight without a federal license. It gives that oversight for states and municipalities to get federal funds if they have the social justice programs, the equity and expungement programs in place. So I am optimistic that we have done a lot of the work to be able to now address things where we can thoughtfully. And I think that descheduling gets us the most bang for our buck day one, because it does allow us to start talking. Well, first and foremost, it allows us to bank. Secondly, it allows us, and more importantly, it allows us to get to the research piece. It allows us to start to take advantage of and compete at some point globally when this is federally legal. So I'm hoping for the best, and certainly supporting the R's and D's as they work on this.
We can leave it with that. We're coming up to the end of our time. I just want to thank all the panelists for an amazing discussion. We certainly have a lot more to discuss, so I'd love to do it again with all of you sometime. But thanks again for joining us this afternoon.